My name is Elena Trishina. It is my honor to interview Professor Niklaus Wirth for the Turing Award Winners Project of the Association for Computing Machinery, the ACM. The Turing Award, sometimes referred to as the Nobel Prize of Computing, is given annually for major contributions of lasting importance in computing. Professor Wirth received his award in 1984 in recognition of his outstanding work in developing of sequence of programming languages. Euler, Algol W, Pascal, Modular. The hallmarks of Wirth's languages is their simplicity, economy of design, and high-level engineering. We will talk about it and many other things later today in the interview that takes place on the 13th of March 2018 in the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology. So, we start. Ready? Guten Tag, Niklaus. Grüezi.
Здравствуй, Елена Васильевна. Добрый день.
Well, although your command of Russian is sufficient, my command of Swiss German is a little bit rudimentary. Shall we continue in one of the languages where we both feel comfortable? So what would it be? French? English?
Oh, I think English is better for me. Yes,
Okay.
Yes.
It's probably better for the audience.
Okay, true.
Okay. We continue in English. Here in front of me, there is a list of the most important days in your life. So you were born in February 1934 in Winterthur, which is a sort of middle-sized industrial town in Switzerland. So can you tell a few words about your upbringing, your parents?
Yes, of course. As you said, I was born in 1934. My parents were at that time already over 40. My father was a geography and geology teacher at the local gymnasium. My mother took care of the household and the cooking. And I was left to my devices. I was left undisturbed and pampered. Yes, and I went to school, primary school.
And now my question about the primary school. The years of your primary school coincided with the Second World War.
Exactly.
Do you have any recollections of this time? Of course, Switzerland was not neutral, but still.
Yes, yes, of course I remember that my father, who was a soldier in the army, was often at the border guard, looking over the Rhine and seeing the German troops amassing. So very often he was away. It was a difficult time in spite of all. We had enough food still, but it was unpleasant. Pleasant was, in the later part of the war, that there were always airplanes going above in the sky, and I became a really small airplane enthusiast. I knew all of them by sight. And one morning I even saw a squadron of liberators flying over the city, and half an hour later I heard on the news that had bombarded the neighboring town, Schaffhausen.
Oh.
Yes, Zurich was also bombarded once, the railway station. It never became clear whether it was accidental or on purpose.
Okay. I suppose the formative years were the years when you were at the gymnasium.
Yes.
Did you have any favorite subjects?
Well, since my really early childhood, I was fascinated by technical matters. There were 4 railway lines going past my house, and I always watched them and became an expert setting up timetables and so on. So railways, I wanted to become a locomotive engineer. But then after a while I switched to wanting to become pilot. So that's a very early youth experience. Yes. And then, of course, I started building model airplanes. That was, so to say, my career. I was fully engaged in this. I have no idea how I mastered going through gymnasium, so to say, at the side. But my major subjects were certainly mathematics and physics and chemistry. I didn't do too badly at languages. We started with Latin as the only foreign language in the first class of gymnasium. In the second year, we started French. In the third, English. Yes, in that sequence.
So, if your hobby and love was airplanes, how come that you decided to study electrical engineering?
Yeah, that's a good question. Starting in the in the middle of the gymnasium, I became a really enthusiast about model airplane building. I even was elected to go to international competitions in England. And then, around 1950, radio control equipment became available, and I think I was one of the very first in Switzerland who ordered one from England. And the thing, of course, never worked. They were very unstable. Nowadays, of course, I know why. So the only thing was to dive into this subject and to learn how these things operate and how perhaps to fix them. And that's then my the years where I had to choose a study approached, and I decided on electronics.
So it was not electrical engineering, it was electronic engineering.
Well, in my mind it was electronics, but at ETH they were one thing. And as a matter of fact, electronics and power engineering separated only in the 5th semester. And in the first 4 semesters was mostly mathematics and physics and machine designing. And I think we wasted a hell of a lot of time on this subject. Not mathematics, that was the thing that I always appreciated and was of lasting value. But the first lecture I attended in electronics was in the 6th semester.
Third year?
The 3rd year, and that was too late. Yeah.
Apparently it wasn't. It worked well for you later in your career.
But I tell you the truth, all that I learned that was of later use in the subject, I had learned at home from books, doing things, experimenting.
Of course, but there is always... The foundation is always necessarily.
The foundations were rather in physics.
Mathematics.
And mathematics,
but
yes.
Also probably design lessons were not so such a waste of time, because you never know, life moves in mysterious ways.
But all these practical things I learned at home from friends.
Okay, the difficult questions. After having finished the Swiss University of Technology, you decided to immigrate to Canada, was it?
Yes.
So what prompted this decision?
Well, first of all, I should praise my father, who had suggested that I go abroad right after studies for a year or two to see something of the world, much to the sorrow of my mother, of course. And I picked this up particularly because my best friend, who was 3 years older, also emigrated to America a year ahead. And I got married, and 4 days after marriage, we went to Paris and to Le Havre and boarded a boat, which took 7 days to New York, and my friend fetched us there.
Your friend,
so that was
Mr. Bruck.
Mr. Bruck, yeah. That was a real experience. Yeah. Yeah. And today I am amazed at my courage of that time. It was a complete break of life.
Yeah.
Being
But you
married.
had your wife to cook your breakfast, so.
Right. Yes.
So,
Yeah.
yeah, I agree. Of course, it was an extraordinary
I had to leave
step at
all
the
my
time.
workshops, all the electronic gadgets, everything.
Okay, so it was Canada. What did you do there?
Well, I actually wanted to go and pick up a job as an engineer. But that was difficult at the time from the distance. But somebody told me I could get an assistantship at the university in Quebec, Université Laval. And I said to myself, well, I accept it. The salary is absolutely lousy, but if I don't like it, I'm at the place and I can find something else. And they had just started an electrical engineering graduate department, and we were no more than 5 students. 1 Chinese lady, 1 Brazilian major, 1 Frenchman, and 1, I think 1, I forgot where, and me. Yeah.
So was it where you were exposed to computers for the first time?
Well, you see, maybe I should say I had taken a job in Switzerland as an engineer, and it was an absolute disaster. I realized that they had taken the wrong job. I couldn't sit all day from morning at 8 till 5 in the evening in front of a workbench and improving a certain amplifier a little bit. And I quit after a month. Terrible. But I then had this proposition of going to Canada, and I thought it was nice. I realized that actually my calling was that of teachers, like my father.
So early in your life, you already
Well,
realized
that's
it.
not so early. I was 22 or 25. Anyway, I thought I had to go into teaching. And that was in Switzerland not possible with an engineering degree. Everything was compartmentalized. And so I thought, if I go to university, I should take some courses in math and physics. And so I did. I took 1 course in numerical computation from a professor by the name of Goodspeed.
A fitting name.
And they had one of the first experimental computers with tubes. And its main characteristics, whenever we had finished one exercise, it had broken down. It was always in the hands of the technicians. And for the whole semester, I couldn't run a single program. Well, this was the state of the art at that time.
Yeah, you were lucky just to see a computer anyways at the time.
Yeah.
Yeah, but you didn't stay in Canada for very long.
No.
So what did you do next?
I stayed exactly 12 months. And then we headed west with a short stop of 4 months in Ottawa at the National Research Council, where I built a small analog computer for computing autocorrelation. And then I took the plane. We had just saved enough money to pay a ticket to California. It was the first
Just
time.
like that? Just flying to California?
Yeah.
With
No. I had been encouraged by my co-students to go on for a PhD. They said, well, just a master's is just not good enough. And after a long hesitation, I finally thought they were right. And I applied at 4 or 5 universities and picked the positive reply from Berkeley.
These 3 years at Berkeley, what they were like?
They were fantastic. It was really a revelation. I had been used to the environment of the drab environment of ETH in Zurich, with courses that were uninteresting, with teachers you never met, with colleagues whom you hardly met because I was rushing home by train to go to my workshop. And of course in Berkeley, well, also after this really stiff winter in Quebec, Berkeley was fantastic. The climate, everything was right. Blue skies, sunny sides. But the surprise was that I was asked to take more courses, more classes in math and statistics. My education from ETH was not considered sufficient in this respect. So I did take classes where we had exercises every week that were graded, and I got good marks. And so the dean's secretary once asked me, have you ever considered asking for a scholarship or a fellowship? No, never. I never would have entered my head. And she said, well, here you have the forms, apply for them. And I got a Ford Foundation Fellowship. And that speeded up my progress towards a thesis quite considerably.
How did you choose the topic of your thesis?
Well, I did a lot of wandering around. I first had an assistantship with a professor in information theory. And after a few months, I found that this was really not my cup of tea. It was far too mathematical and nothing else. And then an opening became open under a professor who was dealing with computers. One of the early pioneers, Harry Husky, and he had, for instance, designed the Bendix G15, and that became available. Was absolutely terrible to operate, but in these early years you just took what there was. And nowadays I'm rather surprised that people could ever get enthusiastic about these poor gadgets. Anyway, I worked with this Bendix G15, and at the side I learned Fortran on the Computer Center's IBM machine. But of course, I had to look for a topic for the thesis. And there was a guest professor from Amsterdam coming in, and I associated pretty much with him because he had really original ideas. En vogue for us, I found a small group of graduate students working in an office in the cellar. And they wrote a program which translated a dialect of Algol, a dialect of Algol 58, to be precise. And that program was written in the language that it translated. So I was very fascinated.
And indeed.
Yes, it was.
Even now it sounds fascinating.
Yeah, it was the language Niliac, an Algol dialect, Algol 58 dialect. And it was really chaos. It was hardly intelligible. It was one woman who seemed to understand a large part of it. And I dug into it. I wrote my first little Algol compiler, Algol 60 compiler. And I thought, anyway, here is a subject in a big mess. It would be a worthwhile project for a PhD student, which has to have some originality, supposedly. It would be appropriate to pick up the task of getting some order into this mess. And that is, of course, how I got into programming languages and totally parallel of compiler design. Because a programming language without compilers is worth hardly anything, as Algol 60 had proved.
So the problem of automatically translating the programs and high-level language into machine code intrigued you?
Yes.
Intrigued, or you thought it was a practical problem to address?
Yeah.
Both.
I had, of course, used this Bendix machine, and even on the IBM did some assembly coding, and I immediately realized that was not the way of the future. That is so error-prone and time-consuming that a better tool must be used. And these were obviously the programming languages as shown by Fortran and Algol.
I want to give a quote. In his 2010 interview, Edgar Dijkstra said, "Computing science started with Algol 60. Now, the reason that Algol 60 was such a miracle was that it was not a university project, but a project created by an international committee." Would you agree with this statement?
Yes, but the members of these committees, not all, but most of them came from universities.
Okay, so you finished your PhD, and almost immediately you became one of the members of such committee, didn't you?
Yes. I happened to get an assistant professorship at Stanford University. Actually, we were only 5 professors, 2 of us assistant professors. And I was fortunate I could simply continue work on my thesis. And we had a fantastic computer, the Burroughs 5000 there, famous but soon extinct. And so I could continue this work, and it made me known in this committee, where this professor visiting in Berkeley was also a member, a prominent member. And so I was invited to attend one of their meetings, and it became a frequent transatlantic hop, which I found terrible. But anyway, I participated in these meetings, and that's how my work flowed into this group.
So people with whom you worked in this group, such as Tony Hoare, Edgar Dijkstra, Peter Nauer, have you been professionally, personally in touch with them through your life, through your working career?
With Tony Hoare and Edgar Dijkstra, yes. I also visited them quite frequently. Once I spent 3 weeks in Belfast with Tony and Jill, hearing the bombs go down in the city. With Dijkstra, I visited a few times in Texas, and I spent 2 months in Amsterdam, although he had gone there already. But Professor van Wijngaarden was the director of that center, and I had received the duty, the charge by this committee to draft a proposal for a successor to Algol 60. And I went back to Stanford and worked on that, and then I think in October I came back to the meeting point and presented my proposal.
And now we are approaching to this famous schism in the working group 2.1.
Yes, exactly.
Are you willing to talk about it?
Of course, of course. We are not here to hide secrets.
Right.
Yes, as I say, I worked 2 months in Amsterdam and had frequent meetings with Van Wijngaarden. And two or 3 months later, we met in near Grenoble, and I presented my proposal. And to my utmost surprise, he stood up and presented his proposal, of which I had no idea. Now, to make the story brief, the difference between those proposals reflected itself in the attitude of certain members of the group. There was one group who proposed, as it was then called, Algol X, something that should be practical, have only more or less proven facilities. It was urgent to get a replacement of Algol 60. There was PL1, the big competition, and so on and so on. So we couldn't wait for years. And my proposal was exactly in this line. Hoare and Dijkstra were also of this opinion. And the other faction, called Algol Y, wanted to set, like Algol 60, another milestone. And the critics afterwards called it a millstone. Yes, and it had to be another big thing like Algol 60 with fantastic facilities, flexibility, and so on. And it became very, very difficult to implement. These ideas had never been tried before. And it didn't become an Algol 68. The first compiler became available something like 72.
And this is how Algol W came to existence.
Yes, I went back quietly to Stanford. That was in 1966, and built up a group of graduate students, and we implemented my Algol X, and it was later called Algol W, implemented on IBM machines, and became quite widely used.
So could you say a few words about this mysterious language, PL 360?
Oh, yes, of course. That was, well, I had to ask myself with this Algol W, how is it going to be implemented, in what language? At ETH, we had only an atrocious version of an Algol compiler, Fortran assembler code, and both were out of the question. And so I designed this language PL 360, which was very close to the machine code, but had some structure. And I used that to write the first compiler, the core of the first compiler, and then bootstrap it up from this. So it was, from the beginning, it was only intended as a provisional tool for my own purposes. However, there were quite a few interested parties around the world afterwards, and it became used here and there.
Yeah.
But I forgot about it very quickly. Yeah.
Okay, so I think, was it 1967 when you quit working group 2.1?
Yes.
And never joined again.
Yes.
So this brings us to 67, 68, when you left United States and returned to Switzerland.
Right.
So what prompted this move?
Well, I received an invitation to become an assistant professor at the University of Zurich. And
At your alma mater?
Yeah, no, my alma mater was ETH. Mm-hmm. So it was the neighboring, across the street, the neighboring institution. And I thought, well, why not? Why not try? I have never been working in Switzerland except that 1 month. And we could visit the parents and see how it is. And frankly, I was on the verge of packing the suitcases again, going back, because I had just asked for a year's unpaid leave at Stanford. But then this offer came from ETH as an associate professor, coupled with the promise that now a computer science department would be founded. Mm-hmm. And that was very enticing because I always had in mind to go abroad to learn something that cannot be learned in Switzerland itself and bring it back.
And bring it back.
Well, that was so good, so fine. But to tell you the naked truth, it took fully 12 years until ETH finally established a computer science curriculum. 12 years.
Okay, but in the meantime, during these 12 years, what did you do at ETH? What did you teach?
Well, we taught programming courses and elementary computing courses at other departments like electrical engineering, like physics, like most engineering departments.
And
so that kept us busy. And of course, I had time to do research. So that was positive.
Yeah. So Pascal had become so widespread, and I think many universities from Switzerland to Germany to Russia to China to India were teaching Pascal, or rather teaching computer science using Pascal as a pedagogical tool. For example, here I have a Russian book, Pascal, Programming на языке высокого уровня, so high-level language programming. And even now, it was yesterday when we were in the computer science department building in front of the Lilies. It was an Indian student who came along and couldn't believe that he can see the creator of Pascal because he studied in India computer science via Pascal. So it was a huge, I think, success. But there was one more intriguing property of Pascal, or at least intriguing for me, that for the Pascal project, I mean, to help implement Pascal on computers of all different kinds, not only on one kind. It seemed that you had taken the approach that now is widely known as virtual machines, right? So you wrote compiler from Pascal to a computer, that a hypothetical computer, and then to port the code from this computer to an actual one, whichever it would be, was an easy thing. So do you think it was the first time when virtual machine came to existence? The idea of virtual machine.
It was a technique known, but not widely known. But for instance, my earlier Euler language was also implemented in exactly this way, that you postulate the hypothetical instruction set and then implement that as an interpreter. And that's usually a small project, it can be done in a few days. And this is indeed how we helped other universities adopt Pascal. They asked us, and we said, well, we can send you our compiler, our P compiler for portable, and you simply have to write for your machine an interpreter for that P code. And that helped enormously spread the language. Also, I must say, Pascal was released a report in 1970, and in 1972, for the first time, I used it in teaching to large 300 people classes. But the actual breakthrough came several years later, namely around 1975, when in America the microcomputers had started spreading and intruding into schools and households. And there they, of course, had to have a compiler that was reasonably small because they had small memories. And Pascal compiler with this P code fitted into the small memory. That's what the company Borland in California picked up.
Turbo Pascal.
Turbo Pascal, exactly. And the big thing was, of course, they sold a diskette with the whole system for $50.
No, really?
Yeah, yeah. Whereas compilers on mainframes cost $10,000 and more.
Okay. But during this time, during 70s, you were also engaged in work on programming methodology, more or less formal methods of program development. Can you say a few words about the method of stepwise refinement?
Not much.
Not much.
It was, of course, for me, it was a natural method.
Can you explain it?
You have a certain task, and because there is not a single instruction on your computer to solve it, you break it up into subtasks. And this you continue until you're down at machine instruction or programming language statements, rather. But of course, you need certain principles and discipline to do that. And I demonstrated this on, I think, 2 examples and published it in 1971, and that became a fairly well-known paper on the subject. But of course, the main flow already at that time was towards more formalism. Hoard triples, Dijkstra, predicate transformers. And I used these things in my classes too. But I never believed that they would be viable when you design huge systems, which from the beginning are not that precisely specified. Yeah.
Anyways, so now we are at 1976, which was also a very important year in your career because of your sabbatical.
Yes.
Can you elaborate?
A sabbatical was coming up. And then the question is, where do you go? And I felt just going to another university and doing the same teaching as it is home is not the right solution. Why should I go somewhere else to do the same thing? And a year ago, earlier, I met Bertel Lampson, whom I still knew from Berkeley at the conference in Los Angeles. And I approached him and said, "Hell, I've heard you are at the Xerox lab and doing very nice things, very interesting things. Do you have a program for sabbaticals?" "No, I'm afraid we don't, but I could look into this." And a few months later, I got an invitation and gladly picked it up. And so in the summer, August of '67, I bought a Volkswagen camper bus, imported it to Switzerland, packed all the suitcases, packed my wife and the 3 children, all in that little car, and we headed towards Antwerpen it was, and then across the Channel, England, and in Southampton we boarded the Queen Elizabeth II boat, which took us in 7 days to New York.
So it was your second crossing.
Second crossing on the sea, that's right.
So, and the outcomes of this sabbatical? Impressions, projects, outcomes.
Yeah, there were so many groups and excellent people at that Xerox lab that it took me a long time to decide what I really wanted to concentrate on when I returned. But after about 6 or 7 months, it became clear to me that I had to have such a personal computer like they had developed with the Alto. I couldn't possibly go back to Switzerland and work through a very thin line with that huge monster in the cellar. No interaction, practically. And, well, what do you do? I mean, these Altos weren't on sale. They couldn't be bought anywhere. Xerox had developed them for their research lab, period. And like with the compiler, what do you do in that case? Build it yourself. If you're an engineer, you can do it. And I was then fortunate to get in touch with an assistant professor of Utah who was teaching hardware development, relatively simple things. And he called me and wanted to know whether it would be possible to come to Switzerland for a PhD in software. He would like to learn about software. And I thought for a while, I said, well, and we want to learn about hardware, might be a good exchange. And he actually came with his family for 3 years. And the result was the Lilith computer, modeled after the Alto, with already a bit more modern technology.
But Lilith's computer was mostly for teaching purposes, right? Or you had more ambitious plans?
Yeah, it was. Yeah, we built 20 of them, and 10 of them were put into a student lab. But the 10 others were in our institute for the researchers. Not only in my group, also in Sanders' group, for instance. And it was it was not just a PC toy. It was the first time I saw such a personal computer with which you could solve real problems, including building a compiler for it. They had large enough memories, enough speed. You could really work.
Yeah, but your approach to the Lilith project was somewhat in the opposite direction that was at the time, because you had chosen, okay, one user, it's okay, but one language, one operating system, one compiler. So, which means that it was, again, okay, I understand that it was for the purpose of doability, right?
Of doability, exactly. I mean, I had Richard Oran, myself, and 2 or 3 graduate students, and we were up to building a whole computer and software for it, whereas companies employed armies to do such a thing, and the only solution was to confine yourself to modest goals, such as one language, one user. Yeah.
And what language was it? It was not Pascal.
That was modular.
Multithread?
And modular is kind of a successor to Pascal, more extended for system design, system programming. And maybe I should say again, at my sabbatical at Xerox, I got to know the language Mesa. That's their company internal research tool. Again, not available outside. And it was very much built on top of Pascal, much bigger. And so my obvious solution was to take Mesa as an example and reduce it again. And this is how modular came up, with the idea of modules and separate compilation.
So was it a revolutionary idea of yours, or you just picked up on some other developments and just made it a cornerstone of your language?
Well, you see, a language designer picks ideas from others, facilities, features, and has the task of putting them into a coherent whole, into a framework. And that is less easy than people might think. Because you want to have as much power in the language as possible, yet a compact structure and compact syntax. And that you can get, I think, only through experience with language design.
With language design also, with system design, with designing compilers for the language system.
Yeah, right, exactly. That had always been on top of my mind. And I had learned that in the early Berkeley days. I had learned how not to do it.
Through?
Well, through that dialect compiler of Neliac, yeah. Often you learn a lot through negative experiences.
1980 was a year of very impactful events in your life. On the one hand, the elation of getting first homemade Lilith machines. On the other hand, personal upheavals. Do you want to talk about this?
Yes, why not? I separated from my wife in early 1980. The difficult year was really 79. But I moved out. I went to a one-room apartment for a year. And I had gotten to know another lady with whom I moved together a year later, 2 years later. So that was indeed quite a stressful time. Very bad, really, a traumatic experience. And I must say, Lilith and work and teaching had kind of upheld me. That's where I could forget all the other troubles.
But you kept in touch with the children. You had 3 by the time.
Yes, it was not a very hostile separation or divorce. I think we were both reasonable people, and if you see that something doesn't harmonize anymore, there's not much to do. Of course, you can make lots of compromises, but we didn't, and we separated in decent agreement. And the children, yes, I have, particularly now in the last 10 years, have excellent contact with them. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, on a more cheerful note, the first 10 years of your work in Federal Institute of Technology culminated in creation of the Department of Computer Science, yes. Finally. So was it a one-man effort, or did you have collaborators who contributed a lot to it?
Yes, of course. It wouldn't have been possible as a one-man show. I'm not born as a big fighter anyway. The one man who played a major role was Karl August Gusti Zehnder. He joined about 2 years after I joined ETH. And we had made a proposal for a new department as early as I think about 71. And it was rejected. And another one in 75, which was also fruitless. It was not so much the school board or the presidency who was against. Actually, they were quite understanding and favorable. No, it was mainly industry, which said, well, we don't need computer science. Programming can be learned by any decent engineer at the site in a few days. And so we need mechanical and electrical engineers, but not computer scientists. And that's how it ended. Also the students didn't show interest, but anyway, then towards 1980, ETH got a letter from Bern, which is the federal government, saying, well, we have several delegations coming and complaining about the lack of programmers in our country. What are you planning to do? What about ETH? Have they been sleeping all the time? Yes, that was kind of exhilarating.
And how many students did you get first year?
The first year we started with a course in the third year, not at the beginning. Mm-hmm. And if I remember correctly, there were about 70 students. quite a lot.
But this is considerable.
And in the second year, there were 150, and in the third year, 200, something like that. And of course, you can't just not bang on the table with a hammer, and there it is. You have to design a curriculum. You have to acquire teachers which are capable, and that was the most difficult thing. Teachers trained in computer science simply didn't exist.
Exactly.
And so in the beginning we were essentially, well, we were three professors. Two of them had been at ETH already, being mathematicians. So I think, in all honesty, I can say I was the only computer scientist there. And then one of them died after 2 years. That was another complication. And then Zehnder came in, made these proposals.
Okay, around this time, 1982, you made your first trip to China.
Exactly. Precisely, yes. Quite so. They asked me, the school board asked me whether I would be willing to participate on the delegation of ETH professors to China, because they had received several delegations from China here, and that Chinese wanted to not retaliate, but give something back. Right. And we were 6 professors, and it was kind of a strange experience. We had, of course, almost every evening there was a banquet somewhere. Beijing, Shanghai, Wuxi, Nanjing, Guangzhou. And in the middle of the trip, we started feeling a bit uneasy because we were only consuming banquets and giving nothing back. And so we asked, listen, what's the matter? I mean, we could, for instance, give a lecture or 2 lectures. And said, oh, yeah, that's a wonderful idea. Oh, great. And next day, there were 2 lectures with at least 1,000 students. They were just popped out of the ground, you know. But it was a dull experience because we didn't get any feedback, no questions.
It's very hard to get questions from 1,000 strong audience.
The real difficulty was that they didn't understand English.
There was no translation?
No.
Okay.
It was 1982. China was still a closed country.
And not so many people would speak English.
We were sometimes, we were treated like foreign, like extraneous guys from Mars or God knows where.
Well, maybe not exactly like this.
It was very interesting, and we were very, very well treated. Very well treated.
Okay, and now 1984, the Turing Award.
Yes.
What was your reaction when first time you've learned that you are a winner?
Yeah, I was, of course, very pleased. But I didn't jump over fences and things like that. It happened to be that I was on a second sabbatical at Xerox, 1984-85, and the prize was given out in San Francisco. So it was just a short hop for me, but it was very big event for me. Of course, in Switzerland, you know, that prize is not known, or was not known for sure. Things have changed a little bit now. No, I was very pleased, and but there is not the same thing as in America, where immediately you get famous and have salary raises and all that. There was nothing of that sort at all.
Who was the first who congratulated you?
Oh, I guess my wife.
Diana.
Diana, yeah, my second wife. Exactly.
Okay, was it difficult to prepare a speech for the Turing Award ceremony?
It was, it was not terribly difficult, but it was work. And at that time, the Turing Award lectures were articles that were published in the Communications. I think that's not always the case anymore, I'm not sure. No, it was a big affair, and it was a big audience, of course. You had to be careful doing a good job.
Okay, second sabbatical and its impact on your future work, on your work after this in...
The influence was not that dramatic as the first one, of course. A new generation of computers had come in 75, and today I call the years of around 1975 the beginning of the computer era. Nothing like Babbage and Leibniz and so on. There were not much to do with what we do at computing, but in 75 these powerful workstations were created, which are in use on every desk, everywhere in the world nowadays. And people don't have an idea anymore how computing was done before, through thin lines going into a supercomputer somewhere, or even submitting card decks.
It was long time ago. Okay, so you came back and started your Oberon project.
Right. That was on the scientific side, the output of that second sabbatical. Yes. And you see, we had been using Modula, had built compilers for it, for PDP-1s and smaller computers. And now, then I had, and then again, like in the first sabbatical where I got in touch with Mesa, this time it was called Cedar, another language, very complex and powerful, for their newer, super efficient computers like the Dorado. And again, my stringent feeling was that thing may be fine, it was certainly developed by competent people, but it's just too complicated, unnecessarily complicated. And I said, you have to do the same thing as with Mesa. You have to create a language which just concentrates on the essentials and leaves the rest out. And that's what I did. And the result was Oberon, a very dense language with a precise report on 16 pages.
But the book on Oberon, or it is the book on Oberon system, which is
there is a book on
thick.
the Oberon system that is, of course, about editors and file systems and all kinds of things, written by Reiser. I think you refer to that. But the text programming in Oberon, I think, is less than 10 pages, a tutorial.
So what the hallmarks of Oberon language and Oberon system? How you can characterize it, how you can describe it to
Well, I think as a nicely coherent system with simple rules, yet powerful features. Of course, it could never have been our goal to compete with commercial systems like Windows and C# and things like that. We didn't want to. As far as power is concerned, I think we are good enough.
So Oberon language and system was also created mostly for teaching purposes, or did you envision some wider audience?
Well, by that time, my ambitions had become more modest. And there was obviously no way to play an influence next to Java and C# and C++, if you have to mention it. An awful thing. But yes, I thought, as I did in the Pascal times, the foundations have been laid when a person learns his first programming language. That's the key. And in order to do a good experience, you have to have a clean language with a good structure, concentrating on the essential concepts and not being snowed in. That is my primary objection to the commercial languages. They are simply too huge. And they're so huge that nobody can understand them in their entirety. And it's not necessary that they're so huge. But people don't want to see that, particularly the industry doesn't. I think the industry thinks it's a big asset to have a complex things that increases their reputation of being sophisticated.
Maybe not so much complexity as being all things for all needs and all
complexity
people.
Is the consequence.
And complexity is the consequence of it. Yeah, well. And of course, the Oberon workstation, it had graphical user interface, it had all the utilities connecting with printers and so forth. So who did all the work? Who did all the programming? Who wrote all this system software?
You're alluding now to the workstation series.
Yeah. Yeah, I wanted to lead from Oberon to Xerox.
Yeah, Xerox was really built for Modular and then for Oberon. And it was, I felt we should retain the ability of teaching and working with hardware in our computer science department. I thought that was an important aspect. And so we decided, or I decided, to build another personal computer, but this time with a commercial central processor. And it succeeded quite a bit. There were actually 3 versions produced by our technicians. Series 1 with a 10 megahertz processor, Series 2 with a 25 megahertz. You see, we were going with the times. And then Series 3 was probably the most interesting. A computer, single board, with completely without moving parts. So we had 60 stations in a student lab, and they work all together, no noise. It was really, I think it was the first station with that quality.
Who manufactured those stations?
Well, the boards were manufactured at an electronics company in Winterthur, small company. And we built about 100 of them.
Mm-hmm. And again, Xerox is on the exhibition in the computer science department building, and we have a photo of Xerox, how it looked like.
Yes.
And I hope the audience also would like to see it.
The chief architect was Hans Eberle on that project.
Okay, who is now with NVIDIA and who was for many years, he was with Sun Microsystems in California.
Right. He was with
Sun
DEC for some time.
Initially, yeah. Okay, now comes your first trip to Russia, 1990, the time of glasnost and perestroika. Do you want to say something about this trip to unknown territory?
Oh yeah, I'm burning to say something about it. It was, I retired 1999, so that was shortly after my retirement.
No, it was 1990. Bukhara, Samarkand, Novosibirsk,
I'm sorry,
Akademgorodok.
Elena. Yes. The big trip came later. 1990, I got invited by Andrei Yerzhov in Novosibirsk, the one who was the exponent of Russian computer science in the Cold War years. And although I had always felt little inclination to visit Russia, was that awful Kremlin. But then it was Gorbachev time, so some loosening up, and I thought it would be the time now. And I went to Moscow, just the airport, changing from what's the name again, Semya? Anyway, going through the whole city to Domodedovo.
From Sheremetyevo to
Domodedovo.
From northwest to southeast.
Right, from
of Moscow, which probably makes 80 kilometers, if not 100.
Yeah, it took a long time. Past the Lubyanka, I just changed, and when we flew at night, all Russian airplanes seemed to fly only at night.
Long distance.
Yeah, to Samarkand in Uzbekistan. And there was a one-week conference there. It was really kind of an interesting experience. It was for young scientists specifically.
Was it an international conference or conference with internationally invited guests?
The latter, yes. Yeah. It was organized by the people in Novosibirsk, a place you know very well. You studied there.
And I even worked there.
You even worked there. Yes, and then afterwards we flew to Tashkent, had a very nice lunch there in the home of the local party secretary. And then in the evening we flew to Novosibirsk, again at night.
Of course, you fly at night and you arrive in the morning. This way you don't waste your time for work.
Right. Yes, you're very sensible. Anyway, I stayed a week in Novosibirsk. And then away back via Moscow, where I voiced my wish to go by the Trans-Siberian Railway. Not the tourist train, but on that track. And I spent 50 hours in that compartment.
In the train?
In the train, together with a single person who didn't know anything but Russian or didn't want to show that he did, probably an apparatchik.
But at the time you didn't speak a word in Russian?
Not a single word, no.
Yeah.
No.
Yet you survived?
Yes. Yes.
How did you survive?
Well,
50 hours
the
is
professor
a long time.
in Novosibirsk, when I was on the steps into the car, pulled out a bottle from his raincoat and handed it over to me, a bottle of vodka. And I thought, oh, what a silly idea. But then the landing car provided fairly lousy food, so I decided I'm there once only. And I survived, first of all, by buying apples and bulochka from the ladies on the platforms on the various stations, and from the bottle of vodka. And I did. It was empty when I arrived in Moscow.
Well, anyways, it is not a bad diet.
Yeah.
You didn't get sick, and you survived.
Oh, no.
Okay, where we are now?
Well, in Novosibirsk, and the fascinating thing for me there was to see a project which had been built there by the name of Kronos, very much according to my Lilith project. And they had done a very good job. It was just a few, three or four young people. Yeah. So they had the complete freedom of pursuing such an esoteric project. And it was very, very touching. Yeah.
So did you speak with them?
Yes, of course.
And they spoke English?
They spoke English, yeah.
You could...
more or less, yeah.
You could understand each other.
Right.
Right. I don't know what actually became of Kronos, the whole project. I suppose after perestroika time, there was no fundings for some time, so probably sort of...
They spread all everywhere, yes.
Yeah. Okay, so of course your professional life, professional interest didn't finish with your Turing Award, huh? It continued, so it was Oberon and Ceres, and now we come to turn around and from software via software hardware back to hardware. FPGAs and...
Yes. The mixture between soft and hardware. Yeah.
So what prompted your interest in FPGAs?
The first FPGA came out in the mid-80s, I believe, by the company, a very small company, Xilinx. And I, as many others, thought it was a rather crazy idea, a big waste of resources and transistors. But we decided to take up some work and build even some editing and routing software, even a language called Lola, logic language. That was all in the 90s.
What was the goal of this project? Was it like teaching projects?
Yes, mostly. Also, at that time, in the early 90s, I got wind of a project that was going on in the mechanical engineering department about building a model helicopter that was autonomously flying, where essentially you could pre-program the computer with a route that it would fly. And I looked at that and saw immediately that they had overdone it. They had 2 Intel 486 processors, which consumed a lot of power. And I was absolutely convinced that's not necessary. And I decided to build my own computer for them. It's actually right here. That's the second version. The first version is a much bigger board, but that was the thing that was flying on the model helicopter. Some processor here, a strong arm from DEC, an engineering sample, memory and ROMs. And the rest is converters, power supplies, and mainly connectors.
What about sensors?
The sensors are here.
But you don't see them.
Yeah, these small chips, it's all inside, you know.
A good piece of engineering. Did it actually fly?
Oh, yes, it did, yes.
So, when was it? Which year exactly when it went to the sky?
Probably about 1996, 7.
Yeah.
The last version.
Okay, so full 20 years before the era of drones as we have it now.
Oh, yes. Right. Yes. But the Swiss Department of Defense never showed any interest.
1996, it was also the year of your second trip to Russia, to Novosibirsk. Yeah. This is where we met first time. I remember it was at this conference.
True. Yes. I guess we danced.
As we danced, indeed.
Yeah.
So do you want to say a few words about this second trip, your impressions with respect vis-à-vis the first trip? It was 6 years later.
I believe it was my big trip to Russia, wasn't it?
Yes, I think it was a big trip to Russia.
It started in Petersburg, and then Moscow, a conference, and then
St. Petersburg again, Petergov.
No, that was beginning. No, but we went to Monino, see the large open-air museum of the Soviet Air Force.
Was it impressive?
Very, very. I was overwhelmed. It was, of course, my specialty, you know.
So you knew all the airplanes by heart?
No, the Russians they were not so much in publicity. But I was very impressed. They have huge things.
Who was your guide there? How did you get there in the first place?
Well, I have my connections. No, it was arranged by some people from the computing profession, and I stayed a whole week in Moscow, and one day we went there to Monino, about 80 kilometers east of Moscow, and one day we went to Yegorevsk.
Yeah.
And there I met with a colonel and his group. They showed me their drones. No, that was also very interesting. On the countryside, Yegorevsk. And we went for lunch and had a party with vodka, of course.
Well, some things don't change.
Yes.
Just perestroika.
Right.
Somehow now we're approaching your retirement time. Or you want to say something else about your work?
Well, of course,
in,
the time
ETH.
between my retirement, the 10 years, were full of trips. I had the time.
You mean after the retirement?
After the retirement, yeah. The Russian trips were part of it. There were 3 to China also, but very impressive, but of a different nature. In Russia, I got to know people quite personally even. In Russia, in China, less so. In Russia, I got up to Novosibirsk and even further to Tomsk. And there they told me, I thought I had been really traveled very far. And then they told me, now you're in the middle of Russia.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Geographically, yes.
Yeah, right.
Exactly.
But China was also something. I mean, the first visit to China was, I felt to be in a different continent. And on the second one, again, different planet, because in those 20 years, China had completely changed. And I think now it will begin the same thing. But that was very, very revealing to me. And I realized for 70 or 80 years, we here had been so exclusively oriented towards the West, France, Britain, America, that we knew nothing about the East, so to say. We knew that there is this dangerous Kremlin, but not aware that there are 150 or more million people around it. And these people are like you and I. Not at all any warmongers or dangerous. And I really felt very relieved when Gorbachev came to power, because it seemed to be a slow opening. Yeah.
Well, the curtain was on the both sides, if I may say so.
Of course.
Yes.
This is also something I realized, yeah. We had lots of misconceptions, and I'm sure the Russians have them too.
Did the fact that you started to learn Russian after your retirement, did it help you to communicate with people, to understand a little bit more about this new...
Yes, absolutely.
But not so different world at the end.
Still on the same planet.
Yes.
Yeah. No, that helped, and that was, of course, my hope. Well, I had this academic goal to test whether after retirement I'm still capable of learning something. But it worked out okay, but after a while the energy dropped. And,
but I suppose you still can read Russian,
oh
right?
yes, and I can even write Russian.
And you can even write Russian.
Yeah.
Speaking, of course, without oral practice is much more difficult.
And understanding, that's the most difficult.
Well...
because the Russians speak so blurred.
I think it's just the Russian vocabulary is so rich, and we have the way to say
and they
the same thing in so many...
together.
Right. So where we are now? We are now after the retirement. Learning Russian was one intellectual exercise, maybe also emotional, because, for example, I noticed in your bookshelf quite many books of Chekhov.
Yes.
Apparently, he became one of your favorite authors.
Right. He writes without undue complexity.
Exactly. And when I read your letters in Russian, I thought, your style is very similar to the style of Chekhov.
On a modest scale, yes.
On a modest scale, so... but also you are still engaged in what one can say professional activity in the further development of Oberon system, importing it. Would you elaborate on it so that people know what is happening?
Incentive came from colleagues mentioning that they had learned very, very much from my book called Project Oberon, which is one of the very few who describe a full system and its development in detail. That's something in computer science that is wrong. People learn to write before they have learned reading. Anyway, that book is there, but it got very quickly out of print. It was too specialized and narrow clientele. And they said, well, that's really just too bad. Couldn't you make a revision, a second edition? And first I was, well, no, it's old hat. But then when I started thinking about it seriously, I thought, well, it might be a good idea. But then one large chapter, the largest chapter in that book was on compiler construction. And that was for a processor that we used in series, which didn't exist anymore, vanished from the surface of the Earth, because it was too complicated, really. And so I thought, okay, choose another processor, write another compiler. No. Then use this chance to design your own processor, again, according to the principles of regularity and simplicity. And then that friend told me, okay, that's a great idea, and you can even implement it. Now we have these field programmable logic arrays. Mm-hmm. You can even implement it. And that's what we did. Now we have commercial development boards about this size here, and from Xilinx. And I've implemented my own processor, and the software is there, almost. And we have many people who are interested in the whole world.
So it is all open source?
It's all open source.
And
it's
one
on
can
the web.
find on the web, so probably going to your website, and then from there going to Oberon
Yes, it's
project.
called Project Oberon.
Project Oberon.
Yeah.
So what about your RISC-V experience?
That's it.
That's it. So
the processor is called RISC-V.
And is it reliable? The design is stable?
Yeah.
Can be used?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
People report you bugs?
Recently, a bug was reported in the multiplier code.
Cannot be.
No, I thought so too. It's actually in that part which is used when you ask for unsigned multiplication, which nobody ever uses. But the sign bit was treated in a wrong way, and I fixed that over the weekend, and so all settled. It's all open source, I understand it.
Niklaus, we spoke about many projects that you undertook in a span of more than 40 years of your professional careers. And if I ask you to tell me a story that illustrates the highest or the lowest point, what would it be?
Yeah, that's a bit difficult to say. You don't necessarily mean professional experiences in general.
Well, here I meant professional experience.
Well, it was, of course, when a system came out and was presented successfully, was, so to say, the termination of a certain development period. That was always very satisfactory, very satisfying.
It was not the moment when you were awarded the Turing Award? The highest point? You don't think so?
At least I don't remember it that way. I'm not the type who attributes too much significance to these events. But it was certainly an important recognition, and that is always welcomed. That's for sure. Particularly after time, you have periods of time when you feel there is not much recognition coming in, and then such a thing is very gratifying.
And the lowest point?
The lowest point? Oh, I forgot them. Obviously.
Good, which means that you remember the highest point.
Yes.
Or, in general, you remember the process, the satisfaction from the process,
right.
The elation when the results are achieved. How many PhD students did you have altogether during this 40 years?
Only about 2,000 over these almost 40 years.
And where they are now? All over the globe?
Yeah, I lost touch with most of them, but in the last 15 years of my career, practically all of them went to California, where I could pick up a job for them with high-caliber research people and research establishments. And many are still there.
But some of them came back.
Few. Yeah.
We spoke a lot about work. What about life, the hobbies? One thing you mentioned at length, actually, the airplanes.
Yes.
Languages? Reading books in 3-4 languages, at least German, English, Russian?
Yes.
French?
French.
Maupassant, I saw Maupassant on your bookshelf.
Yeah.
What else?
Well, the hobby activities, first of all, working in the electronic shop at home, that was a pleasure, mostly, not always. And I like go hiking in the nature, in the mountains even. But nowadays, at my age, you don't do that so professionally anymore. No.
But you can still enjoy it.
I can still enjoy it, yes.
Once you mentioned, I don't remember where it happened, your flight on a fighter jet.
Yes.
Can you tell you
Yeah, that
the
was,
story?
of course, an incredibly big experience, which moved me a lot. It was a friend I knew in America, and I could go and fly in his Tiger F-5 fighter jet.
But the private fighter jet?
Yes. Yeah. He got rather rich through Microsoft.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
But still, it is quite amazing.
He did not only have this fighter jet, he had other commercial jets, and he had 2 helicopters. Anyway, yes, and that was an experience of a lifetime, I tell you. I mean, I had in the last 10, 15 years, when I had trips into the US, I always took some flying lessons. That's very much easier in America than it is here, and much cheaper too. So I learned flying. But sitting in a fighter jet is a different kind of game, a very much more serious business.
Was it scary?
Depends how you take it.
With such a speed.
Yeah, the speed wasn't scary. Once you sit in there, it's okay. But after takeoff, he said, the airplane is mine, and I did the controlling and everything. And I flew some loopings and rolls. So that was very exciting. You know, when you are on top, you look up like this and you see the earth, you know. No, it was, it go up to 1,000 kilometers per hour, but you don't feel that much. Except you are, of course, completely surrounded by glass. Yeah.
Something to tell about your grandson.
Yes.
Newborn grandson.
Yes. It will take a few years, yeah.
Okay. I think now it's time to wrap up.
Yeah.
Of course, you wouldn't pretend to be a prophet, right? But still you think, I suppose you think and you thought a lot about where the programming as a profession is headed, where computer science is heading. Can you share your insights and your maybe doubts, misgivings?
Let's say it from the start that in general the situation is disappointing. We still had times when there was science in our subject. Also, this school has completely transformed itself. I don't say it was wonderful when I was a boy, a student, but at least it was a school and not an industrial complex. Many things are much better now than they were. It's certainly much bigger and much better funded. Yeah. But in computer science, I think too that too much is being driven by business, by research grants, getting the money to do things, and less by the sheer desire to do science and to create new knowledge. I mean, that's essentially what university life is primarily concerned, to create and disperse new knowledge. And nowadays it's mostly business.
Well, maybe without business aspect, it is hard to expect huge progress, because at the end, the investment are done in something that can, again, in turn bring money.
Absolutely, that's right.
So don't you think that you were living in a sort of glass castle? And
in an ivory tower, yes. But the great scientists start with Pascal and Leibniz and so on, Newton, they had no business in mind. And of course, it would be silly to think things can go on like that now. But I'm just saying the tendency is a little bit too strong to only count money. It's, of course, the reflection of the entire world, where there's only one thing that counts: power, and that is money. Yeah. About programming.
And programming languages.
Yeah. Yes.
What would be their role?
Maybe I should repeat that, that my idea was that programming languages allow programming on a higher level of abstraction compared to machine coding. You can abstract specific properties and facilities of a specific machine. You can abstract to a higher level and create programs that would then be available and runnable on all computers. That's called abstraction. And the term higher level language comes exactly from that. Now, to create the general purpose language which relies only on higher level concepts is not easy. I mean, think of it. You cannot make any reference to any machine anymore. You have an abstract thing. You may have created a model for an abstract machine, but that's all. You cannot go to the lab and say, well, let's try it, let's see whether it works. That's out. But unless you strive for that concept of machine independence, portability is the same thing, you'll never really make great progress in the art of programming. Look at today's situation. People program in C++, the worst disease ever created, or C# or Java, which are a bit better, but they all suffer from their mightiness. I'm always expecting they're going to collapse under their own weight.
Well, it is interesting that some languages win, no matter what are their theoretical merits, and some languages lose, if even theoretically, and even as a user for a programmer that would present a really good tool of abstraction. How you can explain it? And apparently it is not only because industry picks up the wrong languages. For some reason it picks up those languages. How you can explain this situation?
It's not easy to explain it in full, but I mean, look at the current situation where Java and C# are predominant. It's simply because of that feedback. Industries create these languages and compile, propagate them. There are the users who flock to them. There are schools which start teaching it. And this way they spread. And then soon when software projects are announced, it is requested that you know one of these popular languages. And for other languages, you wouldn't get anyone. So it's a lot of feedback processes which go to that. It was broken only once with Pascal.
Yeah.
That was kind of a miracle. And I kind of knew that it would never happen again. But Oberon would really deserve it, at least in the domain of teaching. Because that's where it excels, in my opinion.
But you mentioned yourself that universities are becoming more and more grant-driven, money-driven. Therefore, they do what industry wants them to do, maybe implicitly, however.
But that's already in 1970 with Pascal. I realized that industry asks from the university to teach what they use. And universities are teaching what industry requests. So again, a tight feedback loop. Dijkstra once said, you should not give industry what it wants, but what it needs. Of course, a little bit arrogant, but there's a lot of truth in it.
Well, Dijkstra had this ability to
Absolutely.
say good things, right things.
Yeah.
Well, maybe in a little bit too straightforward way to digest.
Yeah,
but
sometimes he edged on.
Yeah, well, I think our interview comes to the end, and I want to ask the last question. Partly you answered already to this question. So what was the unifying theme of all your projects?
Well, the unifying theme, if I think of it, is probably make things as regular and as well-structured and as simple as they can be without losing sight of their purpose. Undue complexity is a bad thing, and it's unnecessary. Except in the modern commercial world, it's often used to hide inadequacies. If something is intransparent, it's much harder to copy it. So not all these bad things happen just by chance.
Obfuscation by design.
Right, right.
Maybe.
At least I would say universities should have been more keen on proper tools, proper languages in our case. But it wasn't the case, because, as I said, universities want to teach what is requested from them.
So our interview came to the end, and what is left is just to thank Professor Niklaus Wirth for his time, for his openness, and I hope this interview would be interesting not only for contemporaries, but for future historians of science. Thank you, Niklaus.
Well, thank you, Jelena, for agreeing to conduct this interview with me. I'm very happy to have chosen you. You were ideally suited. You know my work. And you know me personally, to some degree at least. Although we speak different languages and live in different places. But I enjoyed it, and you did an excellent job. Thank you very much.